是1967年就开始工作了，作为一个那个木工的学徒，然后后来又一直在这个 builder 这一行做了50年。你想想，他在进入 Fletcher 之前是在 City Council 作为一个就是 Building Control， 还有呢那个 Technician Officer， 还有 Sign Inspector， 所以这些呢作为这些那个为 City Council 工作，所以他经常的跑工地，所以对 City Council 的这些打交道这些文件的管理，还有这些质量的管控是非常非常有经验的。在 City Council 工作16年以后，2003年他就是开始参加 Fletcher， 就是在 Fletcher 工作了，从2003年到现在也是16年的时间了。所有 Fletcher 我记得很清楚，因为我跟 Charlie 我是2004年参加 Fletcher， 也是开始为 Fletcher 工作的时候，我记得很清楚。Charlie 呢是我们的 No.1， 每个工程只要快结束了，一定要把他叫过去，开始准备所有的与那个 City Council 打交道的所有的文件、质量管理什么的。所以几乎所有 Fletcher 所有 major 的 project， Charlie 都参与过。所以 Charlie 呢，基本上就是每个工程是由他来结尾，跟 City Council 打交道，把所有的 CCC 拿到。所以他是个非常非常有经验的一个在这个建筑行业工作了50年。他告诉我他是一个 builder， 实际上他不只是一个 builder， 他是可以说是一个非常非常有经验在那个building 这方面 control 还有 assurance technician 这方面非常有经验。所以我一直跟那个 Frank 说你们这些人真的是非常非常幸运。当我们21年前刚来的时候，真的是什么都没有，几乎都没有很多像中国人在这一行工作的，也没有女孩子，很少女性在工作。当我15年前对 Fletcher 工作的时候，因为我是science engineer，走在工地上，人家就跟看大熊猫似的。所以呢，你们有这机会，协会给你们就是有这么个培训的就是这个机会，真的是很幸运。你们不只是从这个整个的一个学习的系统，从全面的到较详细的，从我们的规范到法律法规，到施工组织计划，到怎么样实施，从大方向到小方向，你们都能够知道，都能够了解。就好像刚才说的，当他1998年刚开始为 Fletcher 工作的时候，他是做那个 program 的，就是做施工组织计划部。他就说，他跟别人所不同的，跟其他人不同，他是站在了一个比较高的高度去往下看，所以他就知道他将来是要怎么走，哪里有路。其实你们现在也是这样子，因为你们这样系统的学习过以后，你们是慢慢的爬到了一个半山坡，你们可以往下看，哪里是路，怎么走。这是我对你们的一点点，就是我的一点感受，在纽西兰这个 construction 20年的一点感受。所以你们真的是很幸运，所以要好好的学。当你们也许20年以后就是你们的天下，你们也可以成为另外一个查理，也可以成为另外一个 Fred， 真的是这样子，好吧？努力。然后现在我们以热烈掌声欢迎查理。如果英文有什么不懂的，可以会后跟他再交流，我让他讲得慢一点，好吧？好不好？你用你的这个开始拿。
Good afternoon, Charlie's my name. So I've presented this to the company I work for, and it's mostly to do with big commercial work, but all work has to comply with the Building Act. The Building Act is the legislation. The Building Act, the Building Code, and the regulations are all mandatory. The acceptable solutions and the standards are not mandatory. You can use another method. So the usual one that you would use throughout a small building contract would be the New Zealand Standards 3604. I've got a 3604 here. So that's what you would use just to build a very small addition. But you can also use this document. There's a lot of info. I don't have it all in my head, but that's used just for small housing. Big commercial work is specifically designed. It's designed by an engineer. There are numerous engineers who are used on site. There is structural engineering, which is Jenny's work. There is electrical engineering, there's mechanical engineering, fire engineering is very important in big work. But whatever you're doing, it comes down to the Building Act, which I've got a copy here, which is the Act of Parliament that says you must comply with the minimum requirements. The Building Act achieves a minimum. It does not achieve a maximum. You can always do better than the Building Act. So if you haven't complied and the building inspector turns up and says, this doesn't comply or that doesn't comply, then you haven't achieved the minimum requirements. You can always do better. I use a little example with the guys that I talk to, and I say to them, you can always put a basic tap in, which is a brass tap, turns the water on, but you can also put a gold-plated tap in there, which is so much better, still turns the water on. So there's a minimum requirement. You must have just a basic tap. So I'll just start on this. It didn't come up on the... Okay, so we have the Building Act. In behind the Building Act, there is the regulations, and in behind the Building Act, there is the Building Code. So this is just an example of the Building Code. It's the fire safety precautions ones. There are three main requirements there. There's an objective, a functional requirement, and a performance criteria. That happens even if you're building a laundry in a residential house. There is an objective, a functional requirement, and a performance criteria. The acceptable solutions tell you how to do it. The acceptable solution are one way of complying. If you comply with the acceptable solutions, you therefore comply with the code, you'll therefore get a code compliance certificate. So I'm really just talking all about the Building Act. What we do in the construction is to base everything on a construction program, and I'll do a little construction program a little bit later and some checklists of systems that we use and things that we do on site. I've written this up because the importance to me is the very last line. The very last line down here, and the time frame is when you get paid. So if you work through all of these items and you do every single item on there and you get your building inspector on site, be nice to the building inspector. I'm one. I used to be a building inspector. I like people being nice to me. Don't think he's the enemy. Don't think that he's someone that you can hoodwink, or a lot of people think that don't tell the building inspector. That's actually not a good idea, because the building inspector, they've done a lot of training. They do continuous training all the time with new systems, new law that comes in, new products that come on the market. So therefore they've got good knowledge. Use that knowledge to your advantage. Don't ignore it. So I'll be referring back to a construction program. What I want to do quickly though is just go back through some of the Building Act itself and the what actually happens and the purposes. Well, go back one. Purposes and principles. Okay, sorry. So, concept, the purposes and principles of the Building Act. There is that's clause number 3, and it's of the Building Act itself. It talks about people. It talks about safety. It talks about health of the people. It talks about the well-being of the people. It talks about escaping during the event of a fire. And it talks about sustainable development. Now, I've always called it the People Act because it protects the people. It doesn't protect the building. If the building burns down, get your insurance company to build it up again. We need to protect the people at all times, whether it's a simple house or whether it's a big commercial building. It does not matter. We're protecting the people. The overview has lots of parts to it, and I've just picked out one item. The one item I picked out on with matters relating to the building practitioners and licensing and getting LPBs on board, which you use them a lot during residential building with multiple story building. We don't use LPBs in big commercial buildings. The reason is they are specifically designed by engineers, people like Jenny. They are specifically designed by the engineers, the architects. They are required to supervise that work. LPBs don't have those qualifications. But you do use an LPB a lot in specific wind zones where you've got high wind zones, where you've got cavity systems, where you've got very complicated roofs, where you've got systems which are new to the market. So you use LPBs quite a bit for that. The interpretation, there is pages of interpretation and codes. I'm going to pick on just 3 today. And code compliance certificate, and a compliance document, and a compliance schedule. Now I've said compliance, compliance, compliance. And the reason I've said that is, although I'm a quality and compliance person, to me compliance comes first. Because if you don't have compliance, you have not got quality. You can't have quality if you haven't got your code compliance certificate. So to me, compliance with the building code is the most, and Jenny hears me talking about this a lot in the office and on site. Compliance with the building code is very, very important. To achieve compliance, you've got plans and specifications behind them. See how it includes procedures for inspection. The council officer is required to inspect the building work. And you have to give that man or lady a chance to do that inspection. You might be doing quite a large job, in which case you might have to use the inspector a number of times. And we can write out some lists later of, we'll pick up a job that you may be working on, something that you're doing, and I'll start writing up a list of things that we need to do to achieve compliance. Compliance schedules are used on big commercial buildings, and they're only used for systems in buildings that are that have got fire alarms, lifts, mechanical ventilation, all of those kind of systems. Things that need to have a battery changed or need some kind of maintenance throughout the year. Then it goes on a compliance schedule and it becomes part of the building warrant of fitness. I won't go into all of building warrant of fitnesses because I think that's commercial industrial work. Further information is anything to do with further information the council will want is when you're applying for a building consent, and it might be you've got a simple residential house and you're putting a beam in there, and that beam is greater span than the New Zealand standards have. Then the council's going to ask for further information. How big is that beam going to be? What's it allowed to hold? Lightweight roof? Heavyweight roof? So all of this further information you need and your architect needs to deal with it I've got a few there that particularly relate to the large commercial buildings, fire engineering, heating and ventilating lifts. The exterior cladding is quite important to you guys, but particularly if you're doing housing, because you're looking at cavity systems. You're looking at specific design. You're looking at a particular manufacturer who wants to put in a particular product on the job. That technical information you need to have in your hand so that you can show the building inspector. It's very important that you include the building inspector with all the relevant information. Otherwise, he's not going to pass it. The best thing you can do is get on side with that building inspector, invite him onto the job early, do a walk around with them right from the early stages so that they get a handle on what's going to happen, why, when, and you should have a program of time, date, because the owner is not going to pay you until you get your code compliance certificate. That's usually the case. So taking all reasonable steps means that you as the builder or you're the owner's representative on site, so you're the builder on site, you have to book the building inspector. Book them 2 days in advance because you know that you've booked concrete for Thursday. So ring the building inspector at the same time and tell the building inspector, book the building inspector in, say, we've got concrete on Thursday, we need you here Wednesday afternoon. Make sure you allow the 24 hours, 48 hours notice. If you don't, and they're fully booked till a week out, and you pour the concrete, you might be digging it out again. Because who knows what reinforcing you put in there? Who knows? And one of the key inspections that I used to do, because I used to work up in Albany, and I used to work all of the Albany area as a building inspector. And I did a lot of the commercial work in the Albany Valley on all of those factories. But I also did a lot of houses out in the rural area. Now, in those rural areas, the ground conditions are not tested. Nobody knows whether the ground conditions are good or whether you're sitting on rubbish or whatever it might be. So the first thing you need to do is call the building inspector early to have a look at the ground conditions. So many times I would go out to one of those Albany areas and find you're actually sitting on a slip. The first thing you need to do, get your building inspector, get your engineer involved and the owner involved, because they have to make some decisions. And sometimes those foundations, which you thought you were only going to dig down 450 to a metre, you're now suddenly going down to 2.5 metres or 4.5 metres because the ground is not good ground. It's very poor quality ground in some of those areas. So don't think you can move out into a rural area and just build on the ground. If it's a nice big flat plain, yeah, that's different. Most of the good flat areas, they're built on. They're not there. We're now left with all the horrible sections that everybody didn't want to build on years ago. Guess what? They didn't want to build on them because they were rubbish land. So be very careful and make sure your building control officer comes in nice and early and make sure he can have a look at the ground. If he passes it at that point, he might say, that's fine, you can build on that. Then you can go ahead and do all your prep work and get your, if you're pouring a slab, it's a concrete reinforced slab, or if you're pouring just deep pile foundations, then you can charge ahead. But if the building inspector looks at it and he knows because he's got experience of all the other areas around, and I know of areas up in Albany, and it's a pink silt clay, which is basically, it's a swamp. It's very poor quality ground. You won't get 100 kPa on it. Don't even think about building on it. Sometimes it's quite shallow, sometimes it's quite deep. First person you need to organise, geotechnical engineer. So getting the Act says taking all reasonable steps. That's your job to make sure that's done. Don't leave it up to the owner. The owner doesn't want to know. He just wants to go off and stay on the Gold Coast and let you do all the hard work. The owner doesn't want to know about it. He just thinks you're going to take over and you're going to do it. Be careful of, and the definition of good ground, the definition is in that book. We can have a look at that later. I've put up here some code compliance certificates, things that I have done and dealt with in the past, and quite often we do, on the larger projects particularly, we'll do staged building consents where we'll do 3 or 4 stages of building consents. And the first one was demolition, so it was getting rid of, so the very first one, the application was for demolition. The second one here was the erection of the main foundations and all the groundworks. And then we had a third one which built the actual big structural frame and the actual building work itself. And then the fourth one dealt with all of the internal fit out. So we can do it in stage consents. And that's quite okay, quite acceptable. Not usually done with a residential building. With a residential building, you've usually got just one building consent, which makes it nice and easy. Again, we go back to the program of identifying your personnel, and that particular certificate there is one that we use on commercial industrial buildings where you're allowed to occupy part of the building but not all of the building, and you're allowed to continue the work, but you can get a public use portion which is just the shops on the ground floor while you're building the rest of it. But your whole building consent will relate to the whole building. You can't shut the building consent down with a code compliance certificate. So understanding a building consent process. Whether you've got a small residential building, and what I might do is just do a little quick thing on the whiteboard while this is up. What kind of work do you people work on normally? Are you working on small residential work? Is that the kind of work you're doing? You're doing small residential work. Is it additions, alterations, or is it a whole building, a whole brand new house? The whole building. Okay, well let's have a look at the whole building work. I've got a construction program in there, but it deals with quite a large building. But let's just do, so it's a new dwelling. So let's have a look at what's the first inspection you think you would go for when you're doing residential? Sorry? Pre-pour. Before you pour any concrete. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to get the inspector involved before you cover things up. Covering it up with concrete, putting the gypboard lining on the walls, that's covering it up. Putting the roof on, that's covering up. Putting the outside cladding on, that's covering up. So there's a lot of inspections we might have to get. For a very simple job, you might only have 5 inspections. For a very simple job, an addition of a laundry or something like that. But for an average dwelling, let's put the average dwelling and let's put it into high wind zone. So you need a, so the first one is foundations. Different types of foundations, whether it's pile foundations or whether it's concrete slab, you still need the inspector to have a look at the ground. Because it depends which area you're working in. Some of the areas, as I say, the area I used to work in up north in Albany, that area we had some poor ground and you needed to get that inspected first. If you've got, so if there's 2 different types, there's pile foundations. But in each case, whether it's pile foundations or whether it's a slab foundation, you need to get the inspector involved because they need to look at the ground to make sure. I had various jobs where, as an inspector, I was asked to go and have a look at a job in Northcote. And I went on site to have a look at the job, and they had foundations poured, they had some foundations dug, and they had a lot of work been happening with machinery. Thank you. I might use that one. But whilst I was doing my inspections, I was walking along and I happened to notice a hole in the ground and there was a man's shirt in there. And I thought, well, that's odd, I shouldn't see a man's shirt in the hole in the ground. So I did all of the inspection, very, very steep ground. So I got I said, we must have an engineer involved here. And I said, by the way, you've left your shirt in there. So I went down to pick his shirt up. Underneath was the drain. He was trying to hide the drain from me, even though it was on the plans, and he tried to hide it by throwing a shirt in there. That made me look for more and more and more on the site. If it had been honest and upfront with me and said, hey, look, I've got a drain here, what do you think I'm going to do? I would have been able to say, why don't you do this and why don't you do that, and we can fix that problem. But instead he tried to hide it. That only made me go looking for what else did he hide. You see, so try and get the building inspector on site. Foundations. If you've got a slab system, you need the plumbing inspector. So you need the plumbing and drainage because that needs to be looked at by the plumbing and drainage inspector before it's covered up, before you put your membrane down. Because you've got plumbing pipes in there that need to be on the correct fall, they need to be the right type, whether it's copper, whether it's plastic, doesn't matter. So that's another one. Anything else? Can anyone think of anything else in there? We don't look at services like electrical services. They're nice to have. We don't look at systems which are underfloor heating. They are, if it's in there, that's fine and we'll accept that, but we don't test them because they're not a critical part of the building code, underfloor heating. Not yet, anyway. So then we've got another system in plumbing drainage, so that's just in the ground. Now we can book our concrete, once we get a pass, now we can pour the concrete. Whether it's pile foundations or whether it's slab, doesn't matter. We can now pour the concrete. Don't have the concrete truck sitting out on the road and expecting the inspector to turn up, because he won't. I know, I've done that. There's no point in doing that. So make sure you book you need 2 days in advance to ring ahead, to get hold of the City Council, to get your inspector booked. Then, so plumbing and foundations. Then we've got to look at systems with, the next one after that would be framing inspection. A framing inspection will be pretty well when you've got the roof on, covering the framing, but of course the inspector wants to look at the framing under the floor if it's a typical pile foundation, joists and whatever. They'll want to have a look under there as well, and to make sure you've got all the correct nogs supporting the joints of the flooring right through to the insulation, all of those systems in place. But that's all can be seen and it's not covered up, right? So that's a framing inspection, and a lot of inspectors won't do the framing inspection until you've got the outside cladding in. The outside cladding, that's to protect the framing, particularly if it's kiln-dried timber. If it's kiln-dried timber, you don't want that getting wet again. So you've got a framing inspection is really when you've got the outside wrap on, the first layer. Don't put all of the layers on, just the building paper on. Get it covered in so that at least talk to your building inspector, find out what he wants to do next. He'll want to see the flashings for the windows. There's all of this detail needs to come, so you've got a framing inspection. Framing inspection, window tint, moisture content. I should have brought my moisture meter in, shouldn't I? I've got one in the car. I could go and get that when we have a break. Yeah. Moisture meter. Building inspectors turn up with moisture meters, particularly in the winter, and if you haven't got kiln-dried framing, you don't have to use kiln-dried framing, but building inspectors turn up with moisture meters, and there is a specific requirement to have less than 20%. I think it is less than 20%. I better check my facts on that one. When I was a building inspector 16 years ago, we were allowed to go as high as 24%. Nowadays it's less than that, because most of the products that you're attaching to the frame on the inside require anything down to 16% moisture, and that's the linings, the jib board linings, whether it's elephant board, tie board, or Winston's wall boards, or it doesn't matter whose product it is. Again, track your information. Find out if you're going to use Winston's wall boards, find out what is the requirement for moisture content before you install the jib board. Now, if you've got a really, really tight program, and you've got a really, really tight program, and your owner wants to get you out in and off the job, you might have to use kiln-tried timber, not standard framing that you can just get off the shelf, because it's going to speed up that process. When I was a builder, years and years ago, I'm old now, when I was a builder, we used to build the house, put the roof on, put the wall cladding on the outside, then leave the building alone for about 2 months. Just leave the windows open. Let the air go in and let the air dry the timber. You had to air dry the timber because it was extremely wet timber that you got from almost straight from the forest. And quite often it was native timbers, and quite often it was high density timbers, and it took a long time to dry. So we often had more than one house being built at one time. So we could start this one, leave it alone, start the next one, leave that one, and so on. Doesn't happen nowadays. You've got so many different trades coming in. One trade will only do just foundations. Another trade will do just framing. Another trade will do just jib board. And of course they all want to start when they want to start, and therefore it compacts your program, which means you haven't got the drying time. And drying time is quite important. It's important whether you've, just for paint, you can't sand wet paint. You've got to give it drying time. It's the same with timber. Don't cover it up when it's wet. You will always get mould through that jib board, always. I've seen it too many times. Plane of framing. Then you've got, now with framing, you've got a pre-lined framing and a post-line. So you've got two different inspections. So at this point here, you'll need your plumber involved. Plumbing and plumbing services. Making sure, and there's lots of things to look at when you're doing plumbing and plumbing services, to make sure that your plumber doesn't just drill a big hole through the stud to put his little pipe through, and therefore you lose the integrity of the stud. I've seen that so many times as a building inspector. I've seen pipes put through the underfloor joists and very large hole right in the middle, the joist will collapse. Very recently I had friends who've got a house over in Hobsonville, and that house, we've been doing some renovations to it. We took it apart. We always wondered why the floor was a bit bouncy. We took the floor up, and someone had taken a chainsaw and cut big notches out of them to get a new pipe through, and the floor joists were only that thick instead of being that thick. So yeah, a bit of a cowboy, wasn't a very good idea. You've got to be a wee bit careful with that sort of thing. Plumbing services, make sure that each person is involved. I can go in depth on all of this and spend a lot of time on a lot of different examples. I'm just going to do a brief overview. Plumbing services, framing, this is before you do your linings. So again, critical stages for, you've got a building inspector who needs to be out, and a plumbing inspector who needs to be at the beginning, a framing inspection, and then there's another framing inspection which is post-lining inspections. So that post-line, so that's framing pre-line. Post-line inspections, Post-lines inspections are there for doing bracing systems. When you're, I've got a bracing book here somewhere. So you'll see quite often typical bracing systems. Winston's put out a book on jib bracing, and one of the most important things I come to look at is the structural framing and whether it's compliant with the type of treatment, and whether it's got the right moisture content, and whether you've got no major cutouts and holes and big knocks in the timber, particularly in a brace. In a brace, in a typical standard house, the bracing, which is the structural framing of the thing, that bracing which is supporting the rest of the house, if you don't get that correct for the framing, and if you don't get the correct fixings holding the brace down, in an earthquake or in a high wind zone, that brace is going to fall over. So again, with the bracing, for particularly with jib board, you've got fixings all around the sheet, and those fixings are absolutely critical to getting compliance. So your post-line inspection is quite important, because the building inspector, I'm going to want to see all the fixings in the jib board, and the first thing I'm going to look at is the plans. I'm going to look at the plans that you're going to give me, and I'm going to go round with the plans with you, and I'm going to be saying, right, there's got to be a brace on this wall, and that wall there's got to have this type of brace. Where's the fixing straps holding the top plate, the bottom plate, down onto the joists? So that's another very important one. So then we've got so post-line and also with a post-line inspection on big commercial work. On post-line inspections, I look at a lot of fire rating, and the fire rating is very important to going all the way back to the original comment of life safety, health, safety, well-being. It's the very first principles of the Building Act, looking after you and me. And it's not just me, it's you that's going to be in that building. You're going to sell it to your friends, to your relatives, to whomever, and it's their safety. That's who you're thinking of, and that's why you've got your building programs. Post-line inspection would look at, on a house, you would look at the fixings of the jib board. You would make sure that all those systems are in place exactly on the plans as it's meant to be. Sometimes you can do a change where the owner will come along and say, oh, I don't want that there, I want to move the door further along. And you can change the brace into a slightly different. That's a minor variation, building inspector can sign that off. If the owner comes along and says, I want a great big opening in there and I want to have free flow between these two rooms, and it used to be a brace wall, that's a major change. You've now got to go back to your designer, you've got to get your design of your braces in other parts of the building, because when you're doing your bracing is for the whole envelope for the building, not just one wall. So there's no point in having one wall of the house that is very rigid and all the rest of them are going to get blown to bits. So the bracing calculations for the whole house are important. Post-line. So new dwelling, so we need to do at least 5 inspections minimum. So we've got foundations, we've got plumbing and drainage, we've got framing, pre-line and post-line, and then we can get down to final inspections. So there's usually about 5 inspections, or 5 main inspections, for getting the building inspector on site. That's if you've got everything exactly accurate to those plans. So that's a pretty basic, simple house, 5 inspections. If you've got something that's that needs an LPB, a licensed building practitioner who's overviewing and supervising the work, get the LPB on board, get them there at the same time as the building inspector. Let them do the talking. Let them figure out what's acceptable, what isn't. The LPB might take responsibility for something, the building inspector won't take responsibility of. Where to get to on this? So go back to the construction program I had a construction program in here, and I've got the key personnel, the identifying the special conditions. Now one very, very important thing, yeah, I'll just borrow yours a minute. One very important thing on there is the second one down on this line, identifying the special conditions of the approved building consent. Always make sure when you've got a building inspector on site, you've got the building consent plans to show him. It's absolutely important. The owner's not allowed to hide them. You have to have them on site. I know a lot of people who actually go out with the building inspection plans and they get them laminated so that the copy that's on site, doesn't matter if it's in the rain then, but there's no point in giving the copy of the building inspector that the dog's been chewing out the back in the ute or that's been thrown in the mud and picked up and thrown around. There's no point in giving them that. Make sure your special conditions. Now, in your building consent, you will have special conditions. And I had that up on there a bit earlier. I don't know whether I can find that. It was one of the early ones, wasn't it? I had mostly fire engineering and things up there, so. This'll do. So I've got in here pre-pour the concrete pour inspections. Make sure you're booking them 2 days in advance. At the end, you know when you've got concrete booked. So why don't you book the building inspector at the same time? If you're booking concrete for next Tuesday, book the building inspector for Monday afternoon. Give yourself a little bit of time in case there's any corrections got to be done, or you've got to cancel your concrete pour. Don't book it for the same day. It's not a good idea. Your building inspector might be late turning up. Your concrete's sitting on the road. If the concrete truck's sitting on the road for more than 45 minutes, I'll order it off the site. It's no good. The concrete's useless. The concrete's actually gone off in the truck. And once it's gone past that initial set, the concrete won't be any good and it won't be good high-strength concrete. So don't have a truck sitting on the road for an hour and a half, because if I turned up on site and to do an inspection and there's one concrete truck sitting there waiting to pour and I'm just starting the inspection and the second truck is sitting out on the road, I'll be saying to that person in charge, get rid of that truck. It's no good. It's been there too long. 45 minutes maximum. And that's from the time it leaves the plant yard till the time it gets to your site. Jenny and I were working at the new prison in Paramarimu, and
the 刚收听的那个犯人，从那个他是现在把它放在这个就是最新的那个这个 Paramarimu， 就是在 Albany 那个地方，再开到山里10公里的地方，我们Fletcher 刚刚盖了一个就是10年以上刑法的一个男子监狱，能关680个人的，我们花了4-5个亿。How much the final cost will be?
380, wasn't it? Was it
380 just an initial, might be.
I think it was.
One unit will be 1 million. Okay, so yeah, 那个刚收的现在就在里面每一间里面非常豪华。真的是纳税人的钱，这个是刚刚我跟查理刚好，我们是很少在。那个这个工程比较特殊，因为是 PPP， 就是 Public-Private Partnership， 就是 Fletcher 是 PPP 的一部分，所以我们是 Design and Build。Design and Build 的话，因为一共 How many building we got inside?
9.
Totally.
Not the
2018.
Yeah, something.
About 20 buildings. So, 因为我们是 design build 吧，所以查理呢，就是通常查理的任务是做 CCC， 主要是后面那一块儿。那这个工程呢，我跟查理是整个是在一起的原因是，因为 design 的 build 所有的 building consent 不可能一下子完成，它就是一部分一部分，有的时候 foundation is for the building consent, and when we get to building consent, we're doing the foundation, and then some precast, whenever block wall, whenever， 所以查理就从最早就开始 involve 在这个监狱里面，所以就是这个监狱是10年以上，关10年以上，它就是在奥克兰监狱的旁边又盖了个新的，政府可能花了当时的预算是3.7个亿，那后来将近5、6个亿吧，最后这样子，所以里面是每个犯人是一间，有 shower， 就是有toilet， 对，它是不是个套间，是一整那个 unit 是差不多是2.5乘4米这么大小的地方，所有的 service 就是就你比方说防火，然后还有它里面有照相机然后有 lighting 是白天的 lighting 和就是日光的 lighting 和晚上是整个 unit 是不能够关灯的，是那种蓝光的，还有那个监控器、防火的这些所有东西全部要 precast 在一个 concrete 的 slab 里面或者 wall 里面，是要求是非常高的，所以这个 building consent and building compliance 也是非常非常高的。这个查理从头到尾都参与了，所以你们等一下有时间的话，有兴趣的话，可以让他给你们讲一讲，好不好？挺有意思的。其实你们虽然做 residential， 但很多时候commercial 的东西跟 residential 其实是差不多，但是有很多东西是更有趣，它的东西有些东西是不同的，但是在基础上基本的东西是一样的。就是 residential 它比较麻雀虽小嘛，五脏俱全，但是大的东西，所以它有很多不同的要求。像商业上，它就防火就要求的特别高，所以像我现在在的 NZRCC 这个国际会展中心，它的防火要求就非常非常高，因为是个 public use 的东西，所以查理这些东西都非常明白。可以等一下你们有空可以跟他聊一聊，好吧？要讲 Charlie, just talk about the Perry.
Oh, Perry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had 29 building consents on that job, and 29 was, made my head explode at times. And we had a very, very difficult building inspector who was very, very by the book. Everything had to be by the book. That particular job was designed for a 100-year lifespan, and because it was a higher grade than normal buildings, because at the end of the day it was almost bomb-proof, and because we don't even in an emergency we don't want the worst criminals escaping. So that building is very, very strictly controlled with double layers of reinforcing high density block work, and we had to be very, very careful that the concrete trucks coming in had the right grade of concrete. Sometimes we had 4 and 5 trucks coming on site. We had to make sure their documentation, the driver had to hand me the documentation to say, I've got this type of concrete on. Well, you're in the wrong place, mate, you should be over there, not here. And you've got to be very careful that we didn't put the wrong strength concrete into an area that required very high strength concrete. It took a lot of work and a lot of identification. That's why your systems, your paperwork, your documentation has to be so accurate, so that people can track back when things were done and right down to where did you get the timber framing from. So if the timber framing came from a yard somewhere way down country and it was extremely wet when it arrived, then it's not going to dry in a hurry. So, okay. Just very quickly, I'll work down to here. So you've got, even if in a small job, you've got pre-booking the concrete slab, you've got weather tightness inspections. I'll deal with weather tightness inspections a bit later. But you've normally got lots of pre-booking inspections. On my one, I had fire stopping. But always, the council have 20 working days to produce the building consent if they've got all the right information. If they're asking for information, they put the stop clock on. You need to give the council, if you can give the council 3 days notice before they come out to a concrete pour, that's better. Don't try and ring them on the same day, it won't happen. All right, so there's a key to getting all of these inspected, and this is very, very simple. Small dwelling, 5 inspections, and that's pretty minimal. Do you want to stop now? I'm going to get a dark glass of water, is that okay? So what